How's it, everyone who's watching this? This is my 55th video on the channel, and today we're going to be doing another video on the process philosophers, this time moving away from Bergson himself and onto one of his most famous interpreters, Gilles Deleuze, and his 1966 monograph, Bergsonism. In terms of how this is going to be organized, today we'll go over the first two chapters, intuition as method and duration as immediate datum, whilst memory as virtual coexistence, one or many durations, and élan vital as movement of differentiation will be left for another day. As a last little aside, this video is going to be a bit longer than usual because of how much content we have to get through. Without further ado, let's get into it. For Deleuze, there are three concepts that define the different stages of Henri Bergson's thought: duration, memory, and the élan vital. The purpose of Bergsonism is essentially to map out their interrelations and how Bergson moved from the one to the next. However, any understanding of this triad first requires a grasp on intuition, Bergson's method, and what we explored last episode. At first, this might seem like a strange place to start. After all, it presupposes duration or time, something underlined again and again by the metaphysician himself. Nevertheless, it's also true that there is no way to properly understand his other concepts except via intuition. In Deleuze's words,
without the methodical thread of intuition, the relationships between duration, memory, and élan vital would themselves remain indeterminate from the point of view of knowledge.
Another problem concerns how to treat intuition as a method in the first place, given its role as a rather simple act dealing with immediate knowledge. To answer this, Deleuze says we have to first examine three acts that determine the rules of intuition: the creation of problems, the discovery of differences in kind, and the apprehension of real time. To do this, he lays out a number of rules, the first being that we must apply the test of true and false to problems themselves. In his eyes, it's a mistake to think that only solutions can be true or false. Rather, the same thing applies, perhaps even more fundamentally, to problems themselves. This might sound a bit strange, something he links to a social prejudice that's instilled into us from early in life. However, for Deleuze, following Bergson, it's always the problem that is primary in relation to how it's solved. To borrow the latter's words,
the speculative problem is solved as soon as it is probably stated. By that I mean that its solution exists then, although it may remain hidden and, so to speak, covered up.
Problems and the terms that make them up have to be invented, something as true for metaphysics as it is for mathematics. This isn't to say that the solution itself doesn't matter, but rather to affirm the fact that problems have the solutions they deserve. It's in this way that figuring out whether problems are true or false, meaning confused or ill-stated, is so important. This brings us to Deleuze's first complementary rule. There are two kinds of false problem, those that confuse the more and the less, and those that contain badly analyzed composites. He calls the former non-existent problems, and says that they can be found in the traditional divisions between being and nothingness, order and disorder, and, most importantly for Bergson personally, the real and the possible. In each case, we have a tendency to think about one being more than the other, even when, on close inspection, that simply isn't the case. For example, it seems clear that being is more than nothingness. In the one, something exists, in the other, nothing does. However, as Bergson argues in The Real and the Possible, this relationship is in fact reversed. Bergson explains that there are three elements implicated under nothingness: the being it presupposes, since we can only conceive of nothing from a perspective of something, its negation, it's an absence of being after all, and finally a motive of sorts, being not corresponding to our expectations. As illustrated in that diagram, the very same thing applies to the possible. To quote from Bergson himself,
the possible is only the real with the addition of an act of mind that throws its image back into the past once it has been enacted.
When it comes to the second variety of false problems, termed badly stated ones, a different mechanism is at play. Rather than a confusion of the more and the less, there is a confusion of the quantitative and qualitative. In other words, you're stuck with things that contain elements that differ in kind. This supplements the first kind of false problem quite well, as every time someone thinks in terms of the more and the less, there is immediately a disregard for differences in kind. Together, they compose a fundamental illusion that can't be dispelled by simply struggling against basic mistakes like you find in false solutions. This illusion is inseparable from the human condition, carrying us along, as Deleuze puts it before setting out his second rule, that we must struggle against it and rediscover differences in kind.
The illusion is based in the deepest part of the intelligence. It is not, strictly speaking, dispelled or dispellable. Rather, it can only be repressed.
Deleuze begins this new section by discussing the many dualisms of Bergson's work, like duration, space, heterogeneous, homogeneous, continuous, discontinuous, and so on and so on. In our author's eyes, it's a mistake to consider them as having the last word in his philosophy. Rather, they're simply a tool used by him in order to avoid badly analyzed composites, by using intuition to divide things up by differences in kind. For example, duration is a pure movement. It has no extensive existence, no coordinates or anything like that. However, space does. By making the separation, Bergson sidesteps the confusion that comes from considering them under the same header. Moving on, as shown in this diagram, Deleuze says that the Bergsonian leitmotif is the idea that people see differences in degree when there are actually differences in kind. For example, he attacks metaphysical theories that hold that being is defined by a magnitude between perfection and nothingness. He also critiques science when it falls back on a kind of abstract spatialized time, one that takes things like seconds to be its meters and hours to be its kilometers, hiding duration. In order to demonstrate the use of intuition as a method of division, our author turns to matter and memory, Bergson's second-grade treatise. In particular, Deleuze focuses on the first chapter, where Bergson shows that forgetting the differences in kind between perceptions and affections on the one hand, and perceptions and recollections on the other, leads to all sorts of false problems. To do this, as Deleuze says,
the representation has to be divided into the elements that condition it, into pure presence or tendencies that differ in kind.
Here, representation corresponds to a composite, one that starts out as badly analyzed. It's only through intuition that it can be clarified. Bergson proceeds by first figuring out what doesn't differ in kind. To begin with, he sees the world as made up of images, which have an existence somewhere between a thing in realism and a representation in idealism. The brain in this view is an image itself, alongside the core that responds to excitations. Incapable of forming representations itself, in the sense from earlier, the brain-core relationship instead functions through the production of an interval between themselves. For example, just take a reflex. There's a gap between the doctor whacking your knee and its movement. On account of this interval, there's an operation of selection that takes place. Only the aspects of the object that interest the being perceiving it get through. In this way, Bergson argues that perception is not the object plus something, but rather it minus something. That's to say, everything that doesn't matter to us. On this first line, we can thus say that, on the one hand, there is no difference in kind between the brain and the core as images, nor, on the other hand, the perception of matter and matter itself. As a result, we can say that perception puts us immediately into matter itself, something he promises to get back to later. For now, though, it's possible to draw out a second line, distinct to the first. Here Deleuze stresses that our original line of perception object matter required a set of fictions. In particular, the body was treated as it existed like a mathematical point in space, something instantaneous and capable only of perception. With the new line Deleuze seeks to develop here, it's time to introduce three new concepts into the equation: affectivity, recollection, and contraction memory. As he writes,
first, there is affectivity, which assumes that the body is something other than a mathematical point, and which gives it volume in space.
Recollection comes in to connect the instance of our no longer mathematical body, bring the past into the present. Finally, contraction memory works by, while contracting, matter together to produce qualities. This last element in active synthesis allows being to durate in time, although the specifics are a bit too complicated to dive into here. Deleuze's main point is that these together form the line of subjectivity, which places us at once into the mind, rather than matter like we saw in perception. However, again, it's important to underline that both these lines always mix together in composites. In fact, Deleuze goes as far as to say that their interpenetration is experience itself. Problems only arise when we muddle these two lines up and take them as being the same kind. It is only through intuition that we can avoid this, which Deleuze describes as taking us beyond the state of experience and towards its conditions. In other words, towards its two lines. Nevertheless, even despite the name, this isn't a simple procedure. Getting to the focal point implied by the conditions of experience requires a multitude of intuitive acts that can often appear contradictory. On the one hand, we must group all sorts of things that seem to go against each other together to create the lines in the first place. On the other hand, we then have to push what results as far as possible, escaping the limited bounds of our experience and entering the territory of pure perception or pure memory. Bergson seeks to go beyond the human condition, on which Deleuze writes,
"This is the meaning of philosophy, insofar as our condition condemns us to live among badly analyzed composites, and to be badly analyzed composites ourselves."
This in no way implies a flight to concepts. As we saw in our video on an introduction to metaphysics, Bergson isn't exactly the biggest fan of them. By necessity, they are only ever general and abstract, never containing the singular and unique particularities that actually make up the conditions of experience. When we explore the inhuman or superhuman, which Deleuze links to less and superior durations respectively, it's only in order to find what these particularities depend on. The operation through which we see pure forms of memory and perception is called the turn by Bergson. Following it, we eventually end up at a point where the two lines intersect, something Deleuze describes as a virtual point. It's this that gives us the sufficient reason for a thing, to again borrow his phrasing. What Deleuze means by this is that there's a point where we can grasp it in its absoluteness, driven by intuition. It's on the basis of this idea that he makes his claim that dualism in Bergson just marks a moment that leads to the formation of a monism. Together, the two aspects of a turn, that is, the divergence of the lines in the name of differences in kind, and their eventual intersection at the virtual point, comprise what Bergson calls precision in philosophy. They act to complement the second rule, explain how problems, when properly stated, basically solve themselves. In Deleuze's eyes, Bergson solved the mind-body problem only by showing that subjectivity and objectivity, memory and perception, and so on, all converge at the same place. With this, we get to Rule 3.
State problems and solve them in terms of time rather than of space.
This is fundamental to intuition, since, as we discussed at the beginning of this episode, it presupposes duration. In fact, it can only be thought through the lens of duration itself. Something that Deleuze says requires a return to the movement behind the division of differences in kind. In his eyes, it's only superficially true that these divisions occur between things or tendencies. To see why and how, we have to examine the most fundamental of Bergson's separations, that between duration and space. Here, we find that the former, as time, is what carries differences in kind, being completely heterogeneous and qualitative. Space, on the other hand, is simply quantitative. It can thus only present differences in degree. Here, we're faced with a dilemma. There's no real differences in kind between duration and space, because such differences can only exist in the first. What we're left with is two aspects, the one temporal and the other spatial, both with their respective differences. In order to illustrate these two, Deleuze focuses on Bergson's famous example of a lump of sugar dissolving in tea. Examining it from only the perspective of its spatial structure, we just see differences in degree, like its size relative to that of the cup it's in, or the spoon used to stir it. To get the full picture, we also need to take count of its duration, its way of being, in other words, which reveals itself at least partially through the act of dissolving, distinguishing it from its surroundings and even itself. The alteration between states is what Bergson sees as the essence of a thing, only graspable through duration. In this way, Bergson's statement that he must wait for the sugar to dissolve has wide-ranging implications, Deleuze stating,
It signifies that my own duration, such as I live it in the impatience of waiting, for example, serves to reveal other durations that beat to other rhythms that differ in kind from mine.
When it comes to problems of philosophy, this way of dividing allows us to solve a methodological issue that has plagued metaphysics since Plato. Essentially, although other philosophers have tried to work out how to turn division into a method for a long time, the choice of what line or side to follow has long been a problem. Bergson, by dividing between quality and quantity, or time and space, manages to sidestep this through positioning only one as essential, that of duration. However, it's important not to confuse this line with the method that separates it out. As Deleuze says, intuition is not duration. Instead, it's the means by which we are able to go beyond our own inner duration in order to affirm others, like that of the inhuman lump of sugar. As much as it's presupposed by intuition when it comes to determining true differences in kind, duration also requires a method in order to raise it above being nothing more than a psychological experience. To end off this chapter, it's here that Deleuze returns to the fundamental illusion from earlier, where we see quantitative differences where they are rather qualitative ones. In his eyes, it's much more fundamental and profound than just another element of the human condition. Instead, space, despite its illusory nature, is grounded in the very nature of things. Throughout Bergson's work, we find a gradual evolution, where duration becomes more and more ontological instead of psychological, and space becomes less and less reducible to a fiction. Linking the latter to matter, Deleuze writes,
"The absolute," said Bergson, "has two sides, aspects. Spirit imbued with metaphysics and matter known by science."
Science, as we saw in an introduction to metaphysics, cannot be discounted, something that Bertrand Russell strangely accused Bergson of proclaiming quite famously. Instead, it acts as one half of any ontology. In words very reminiscent of his doctoral thesis, Deleuze says that the absolute is difference, but a difference with two sides, the one in degrees, the other in kind. At the end of the day, even if it is illusory, we're still in the absolute when science invites us to study the world quantitatively. What makes it an illusion is that we project it onto the qualitative and what truly differs in kind. We can only overcome it if we employ making use of intuition in order to find in duration the final differences in kind that correspond to those in space, matter, and extensity. Closing the chapter, Deleuze outlines once again the three rules of intuition as method. In his words,
"This is a problematizing method, a critique of false problems and the invention of genuine ones, differentiating, carvings out and intersections, temporalizing, thinking in terms of duration."
On this note, we arrive at chapter 2 of Bergsonism, titled Duration as Immediate Datum. Here, as the title suggests, Deleuze explores the nature of time in Bergson's thought, with a particular focus on its division between qualitative and quantitative multiplicities, a set of concepts that you might recognize from Difference and Repetition, or A Thousand Plateaus. However, before we get ahead of ourselves, it would be worth it to at least have a basic understanding of what exactly duration is, beyond its connection with time. Essentially, it's a kind of becoming, a process of transition and change that, nonetheless, has its elements endure rather than simply disappear, like a string of separated instants. As we saw earlier, it goes beyond lived experience and acts as one of its conditions. Multiplicities come into play as a way to divide durations from space, where the former is virtual and continuous, whilst the latter is actual and discrete. To understand this, as Deleuze says, we have to go all the way back to how Bergson came to use the word multiplicity in the first place. Essentially, the term can't be reduced down into a synonym for multiple. Instead, it's a borrowing from the incredibly influential physicist and mathematician Bernhard Riemann, designating, to take almost directly from the text, what can be determined in terms of its dimensions or independent variables. If you've seen my series on intensive science and visual philosophy, an example is a pendulum. When considered as a multiplicity, it has two dimensions, one for momentum, the other for velocity. Returning to the text, Deleuze explains that Riemann distinguished between discrete and continuous multiplicities. As he writes,
"The former contain the principle of their own metrics, the measure of one of their parts being given by the number of elements they contain."
The latter, on the other hand, was a bit more problematic. However, for us, these specifics don't quite matter, especially since they act as a point of contention between Riemann and Bergson's accounts. What is important is that Bergson considers space to fall into the realm of the discrete, and duration to fall into the realm of the continuous. The question Deleuze wants to answer here is how he explained the second categorization, using what he himself admits is a very difficult passage from Bergson's thesis, Time and Free Will. Deleuze specifically focuses on the division between the subjective and the objective. Bergson's use of these terms is almost misleading, in the sense that they get a very different meaning than expected. Specifically, the objective refers to actual things, that's to say, things that can be divided in degree, never changing in kind. So far, so good, numbers being a perfect example. However, everything gets a bit more complicated with its subjective counterpart and qualitative multiplicities. Here, we return to the idea that duration divides, hence the designation multiplicity. However, it doesn't do so cleanly like you find in objects. Rather, it itself changes in kind whilst dividing. Where things get even more complicated is in Deleuze's statement that duration is the virtual. What this means is that, on the one hand, it exists only temporally. On the other hand, though, it's also inseparable from its actualization. Through the process of dividing and differentiating itself, duration as a virtual multiplicity gives rise to the potential for numerical elements. At this point, Deleuze states,
"A very important aspect of the notion of multiplicity is the way in which it is distinguished from a theory of the one and the multiple."
Here, we see him take a bit of a step back from this idea of a virtual. His main focus now is to discuss dialectics and the way certain philosophers have tried to get around the divide mentioned in the quote. As seen here, some try to reconcile the concept through Fichte's old equation of thesis, the one, antithesis, the multiple, and synthesis, the unity of a multiple. In Deleuze's reading, Bergson sees the dialectical methods like this one as being problematic for a number of reasons, such as their reliance on concepts that, as Deleuze describes, are the size of baggy clothing. They work from the general to explain the singular, which essentially goes against everything the two philosophers stand for. Here, he knows what he sees as a Platonic tone in Bergson's work. Plato, he relates, was one of the first people to deride thinkers who would try to combine concepts in this way, asking questions like what unity and what multiple. This is exactly what Bergson seeks to develop in his theory of multiplicities, which can never be reduced down into either opposite term in the division. Now, it's with this that I'd like to conclude this episode on Bergsonism by Gilles Deleuze, having set the groundwork for an exploration of multiplicities, the virtual, and the actual. I truly hope you enjoyed or learned something, and if you feel I got anything wrong or wasn't as clear as I could have been, please do feel free to let me know in the comments so I can do better. Next time we'll be looking at another lecture by Alfred North Whitehead, titled Expression. Until then, bye!